This next video is going to look at control of blood flow and the three different mechanisms of control. The first mechanism is local control. This type of mechanism serves localized tissue and increases blood flow to the tissue area when the tissue becomes more active. The second mechanism involves the nervous system via sympathetic stimulation of peripheral blood vessels. The third mechanism includes sympathetic hormones, which will have the same effect as the sympathetic nervous system, but will be longer lasting, as these will be hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Local control takes place around localized tissue. Nervous control refers to sympathetic stimulation, and again, hormonal control is through epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones, which are sympathetic hormones. So local control affects organs that are very active and have the greatest blood flow, like the brain, kidneys, liver, and skeletal muscle. The way that local control works is that blood flow to that tissue changes to accommodate the activity of the tissue. If the tissue becomes very active, blood flow increases. If the activity of the tissue diminishes, blood flow decreases. This is done through the capillary sphincters in the capillary beds, which can constrict or dilate to accommodate the blood flow to the tissue. So, as we mentioned, when a tissue is metabolically active, it's going to need more blood to it. So how does the capillary sphincter dilate when a tissue is more active? Well, that has to do with the condition of the tissue, the chemical conditions of the tissue. When tissue is active, waste accumulates in the tissue. That is CO2 and acids. Also, there is a high concentration of carbon dioxide at the same time as there is low oxygen. These conditions are going to relax the precapillary sphincters and allow more blood into the tissue to deliver more oxygen and remove more waste. Now, over time, a tissue that is consistently more active will grow more capillaries, but local control responds to temporary needs of a tissue based on its activity. So this is what this PowerPoint is depicting. On the left-hand side, we have a tissue in which the precapillary sphincters are dilating, and you know that by the arrows going outward and noting that the blood flow is going to increase to the tissue. So you can see blood flow coming from an arteriole into the capillary is going to increase. The tissue has the characteristics of active tissue, the tissue around the capillaries, which is going to be, it's going to have a low concentration of nutrients. So we're going to have low concentrations of nutrients, oxygen, glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, essentially nutrients. At the same time, there will be a high concentration of waste, such as CO2, lactic acid, other acids. On the right-hand side, we have tissue that is not active, and you can see how the precapillary sphincters have constricted. The arrows are pointing towards the sphincter. You can see blood moving away from the capillary bed. The tissue in this area is going to be not active tissue. There's going to be high levels of oxygen. Let me erase that. Because the tissue is not active, it's not consuming the oxygen. so the oxygen is going to be high. High levels of nutrients such as glucose, fatty acids, amino acids. At the same time, there will be low levels of waste such as CO2 and acids. So you should know the conditions that correspond to active tissue, and that those conditions are going to relax the precapillary sphincters to allow more blood into the tissue, and the conditions that constrict the precapillary sphincters when tissue is not active. The second type of control is the nervous system regulation via the sympathetic nervous system. Now, this is the way the sympathetic nervous system works. First of all, the types of blood vessels in which the sympathetic nervous system has greater control are the blood vessels that are called peripheral blood vessels. And that's an important point. Peripheral blood vessels are going to be blood vessels of the gastrointestinal tract, stomach, intestines, kidneys, spleen, skin. These are the types of blood vessels that have prominent sympathetic stimulation. That means that blood vessels from brain, heart, lungs, skeletal muscle have less sympathetic stimulation. So they are not going to respond, the blood vessels of those organs are not going to respond prominently to sympathetic stimulation. And that is a very important point to remember. Sympathetic stimulation will be prominent in peripheral blood vessels. Okay. Sympathetic stimulation has very little to do with capillary beds, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and brain. We mentioned that. Sympathetic stimulation is going to constrict peripheral blood vessels. We have mentioned that in the past. Sympathetic stimulation is going to innervate the smooth muscle in the tunica media of peripheral blood vessels and cause the muscle to constrict, causing vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. What that means is that blood flow to the peripheral organs is going to be diminished. So sympathetic stimulation will diminish blood flow to peripheral blood vessels, so there will be less blood flow to peripheral blood vessels, and that means that more blood will be available to the more important organs, which will be skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, brain. Okay? So, when the body is under stress, it will constrict blood vessels of non-important organs, GI tract, kidneys, spleen, skin, reproductive organs, and divert that blood to the organs that are more important when we're under stress: skeletal muscle, capillary muscle, brain. Okay? And this is a concept that we're going to be working with the entire semester. So we need to make it very, very clear as to how the sympathetic nervous system, what the effect is of the sympathetic nervous system on blood vessels. Okay. Now, at any given time, all blood vessels are slightly constricted at all times. So when sympathetic stimulation increases, the vessels are more constricted. If it decreases, they will be less constricted. Okay, but that slight constriction of blood vessels due to the sympathetic nervous system is called vasomotor tone. And that is always present. And it will just increase or decrease depending on the level of sympathetic stimulation. Remember that the neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system is norepinephrine. So what the chemical that is actually causing this result, this constriction, is norepinephrine. And depending on the level of stimulation, vasomotor tone may increase or decrease. The vasomotor centers the brain centers that control this vasomotor activity is found in the pons and in the medulla oblongata. So these are, especially the medulla oblongata, is the center that controls vasomotor tone. This center is constantly receiving information about blood pressure throughout the body from baroreceptors, and I say throughout the body, I mean through the blood pressure in the carotids and the aorta. The baroreceptors are found in the carotid arteries and the aorta arteries. The vasomotor centers are also receiving information from chemoreceptors found in the same centers. So these centers are constantly being fed information, and based on that information, they're going to respond by increasing sympathetic stimulation or decreasing sympathetic stimulation. Okay, so again, vasomotor centers are found in the medulla oblongata. Vasomotor tone may increase or decrease depending on the information being sent by the medulla oblongata. So the vasomotor center will innervate the tunica media of blood vessels, vasoconstricting or vasodilating depending on what's needed. So again, I know I'm repeating myself, but this is an important point. The vasomotor centers are constantly receiving information from baroreceptors, meaning blood pressure receptors, and chemoreceptors in the aorta, what we call the aortic bodies, and the carotid bodies. So baroreceptors detect blood pressure, that's easy enough. Chemoreceptors are going to be sensitive to levels of CO2, pH, and to some degree oxygen. So that's what chemoreceptors are keeping track of. And again, CO2 and pH are the most important ones. So for example, if blood pressure decreases and the baroreceptors detect a decrease in blood pressure and transmit the information to the medulla will respond by increasing sympathetic stimulation. And that will increase vasoconstriction of peripheral blood vessels, moving blood from the non-important organs towards the important ones, the heart, lungs, brain, skeletal muscle. So blood pressure, because blood pressure is read essentially in the aorta, blood pressure will increase. So blood pressure is the pressure in the aorta. If we divert blood from everywhere else except these important organs, there will be more blood in these organs and blood pressure will increase. Having said that, the cerebral cortex and the hypothalamus can also influence the vasomotor center. So it's not just the baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Cerebral cortex can influence through emotional response, which typically increases vasomotor tone, makes us more tense. The temperature or visceral input and receptors may also influence vasomotor tone. Similar to sympathetic stimulation, sympathetic hormones are going to have exactly the same effect, except that in this case, the effects will last longer. Sympathetic hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, causes vasoconstriction of peripheral blood vessels in response to low blood pressure, low blood volume, stress. Stress can be something like exercise. So it's the same effect as the sympathetic nervous system. So at this point, you should know the conditions present in capillaries of a skeletal muscle in regards to metabolic waste and oxygen levels. And skeletal muscle is a good example of active tissue. So that's why they mention skeletal muscle specifically. And what is the effect of these metabolic effects on active muscle on the capillary sphincters. So low oxygen, low waste, low nutrients, high waste will relax the capillary sphincters. Where in the brain is the vasomotor center located? We mentioned the medulla oblongata, and the organs that are strongly constricted by the sympathetic nervous system. You should definitely know those. The kidneys, the GI tract, skin. And under what conditions are these blood vessels constricted by sympathetic stimulation? They respond to baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. So it will be conditions such as low blood pressure, high acidity, high CO2. Okay. So you should know that increasing sympathetic stimulation is going to increase vasomotor tone, which means it's going to increase blood pressure by diverting blood towards the central organs, heart especially, brain, skeletal muscle, lungs.